I'm Sarah, licensed professional counselor in the state of Michigan, and I work with those who have dissociative experiences. So I'm going to be throwing a lot of information out to you today. So I hope you can follow along, and if you have any questions, drop them down below. Hearing voices happens in both dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia spectrum disorders. So how do you tell them apart without guessing? Today we're breaking down a 2023 peer-reviewed study that compared the details of voice, hearing, and thought patterns in both groups. The results are practical, stigma-reducing, and honestly overdue. So a quick note before we start, this video is educational, not diagnostic or medical advice. If you're in crisis or worried about safety, please contact local emergency services or a trusted clinician. Okay, let's get into it. I'm going to be spitting a lot of information at you. DID and schizophrenia spectrum disorders, I'll just say SSD, can look similar on the surface. Think hearing voices, confusing thoughts, beliefs about control that overlap and can lead to misdiagnosis, delayed care, and the wrong treatment plan. The study asks a very focused question. What specific features of voices and speech actually differentiate DID from SSD, especially when you account for trauma and depersonalization? Those two factors can shape how voices are experienced across diagnoses. Here's what the researchers did in plain English. They interviewed 89 adults who currently hear voices, 44 with DID and 45 with SSD. That's schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder combined. Participants were recruited from services in New Zealand and Australia. Everyone completed structured interviews that looked at three big areas. Auditory hallucination details using the PSI-RAT scale. Questions like where do the voices seem to come from, how often, how loud, how distressing, can you control them were asked. How people interpret their voices using the IVI. For example, do you see the voices as spiritual or metaphysical? Do you think they mean you'll lose control? Do you see them as positive? Formal thought disorder using the SAPS FTD model. That's things like derailment, ideas drifting off track, incoherence, speech that's hard to understand, word sound substitution, picking words because they sound alike, sometimes called clanging, plus tangibility, circumstantiality, pressure of speech, distractibility, and so on. They also measured two key influences. Childhood maltreatment with the CTQ, because trauma history is strongly linked to voice hearing across diagnoses. Depersonalization, derealization with a brief scale, because dissociation also often travels with voices and can raise distress. And this next part is crucial. They compared DID and SSD twice, once straight up and then again controlling for gender, depersonalization, and childhood maltreatment. That way they could ask, is this difference about diagnosis or is it really about trauma or dissociation? Let's start with the location and origin of voices. Finding number one, people with DID were more likely to experience voices as internally located and more likely to believe those voices were internally generated, as in this comes from inside me, and that difference stayed significant even after controlling for trauma, depersonalization, and gender. In other words, internal location and internal origin belief are more DID typical signatures. A clinical takeaway here, always ask both questions. Where does the voice seem to be, and where do you believe it actually comes from? People answer these differently, and the pattern absolutely matters. At first pass, voices were reported as louder in DID, but as soon as the researchers controlled for childhood maltreatment, that difference disappeared. A translation could be that higher perceived loudness looks more like a trauma severity effect than a diagnosis effect. Since the higher DID group had much higher childhood maltreatment scores, loudness likely reflects that those deep experiences echo in the person's systems more than which label they have. Now, what about distress and interpretation of voices? Two key findings after the controls were applied. Distress, both how often and how intensely voices were distressing, was higher in the SSD group. Metaphysical interpretations like the voices are spiritual or have been chosen were also higher in the SSD group after controlling for trauma and depersonalization. That pattern likely reflects psychotic style appraisals being more common in SSD. Meanwhile, an initial signal that DID folks felt voices meant they would lose control went away once trauma and depersonalization were controlled for. Suggesting those two factors, not diagnosis, explained that feeling of threatened agency. SSD leaning was distress was up, metaphysical beliefs were up, loss of control belief, largely depersonalization and maltreatment driven. Let's talk formal thought disorder, how speech shows up and what thoughts are actually doing. Before controls, the DID group showed more derailment, illogicality, circumstantiality, pressure of speech, and distractible speech. But after controlling for gender, trauma, and depersonalization, only one DID feature remained higher, derailment. That's where ideas slip off track while the sentences themselves still make sense. By contrast, after controls, the SSD group showed more incoherent speech that's hard to follow and more changing when substituting words based on sound, or a clanging-like feature. SSD leaning after controls, incoherence was up, Word sound substitution was up, like changing or clanging like. A practical clue: if speech drifts but remains syntactically intact, think derailment. That's more DID typical in the study. If the sentences themselves become hard to phrase or parse out, that is likely SSD leaning features. Just as important, several voices variables didn't separate DID and SSD even after controls. No reliable differences in how often voices occur, how negative the content is, and how much voices disrupt life, perceived controllability of voices, positive beliefs about voices, as in these were low across the board. A big lesson from this study is what you must measure: childhood maltreatment and depersonalization. Depersonalization is common in both DID and SSD and can inflate distress and shape how voices are appraised. In the stats, it sometimes masked differences that were actually SSD leaning, like metaphysical beliefs or incoherence, until it was controlled. Childhood maltreatment was much higher in DID here, and they explained differences like loudness, and it influenced other comparisons too. So if you don't account for trauma and depersonalization, you can easily misread which features are DID-ish versus SSD-ish. If you're a clinician or you're self-tracking, here's a 5-question flow you can use right away. 1. When a voice shows up, where does it seem to be? Inside your head or body, or outside in the room? 2. Where do you believe it actually comes from? Inside you, or from something or someone else? 3. How distressed do you feel during and after? Do the voices carry metaphysical or special mission meanings? 4. When you talk, do your ideas drift off track even though the sentences still make sense? That's derailment, a DID leaning clue for this study. 5. Do the sentences themselves become hard to follow, or do you pick words because they sound alike? That points more towards SSD leaning features here, incoherence or word sound substitutions. The authors offer a helpful way to think about why these patterns might differ. The DID leaning markers, internal, location, origin, and derailment, may reflect structural dissociation. Different self states intrude on thought and speech without losing reality testing. So the voice feels internal and ideas can drift as another self state leans in. SSD leaning markers, metaphysical appraisals, incoherence, and sound-driven substitutions may reflect psychotic processes like shifts in reality testing and loosens associations. Again, these are tendencies, not hard rules. No study is perfect, so let's be fair about the limits. It's a convenient sample, and their groups were perfectly gender matched, which mirrors real clinics, but isn't ideal scientifically. Sample size was modest, good for medium-sized effects, but replication is needed. Some measures rely on self-report, even though the interviews were structured. Use these findings as guided nuance, not a checklist that replaces comprehensive assessment. So what do we do with this information? Clinicians, add 2 things to your standard voice hearing assessment: location versus origin belief, and a quick screen for depersonalization and childhood maltreatment. If your mental map, weigh derailment towards DID and incoherence word sound substitutions towards SSD. This matters because the treatment pathways differ. DID often benefits from phase-oriented, trauma-informed psychotherapy focused on safety, stabilization, and parts cooperation. SSD care often centers on antipsychotic medication and psychoeducation about voices and different trauma therapies when dealing with SSD.